This thing that I'm holding in my hand, this telephone, this camera, it is quite powerful. Social media is powerful. We can do something with this. If we want to change, we can really, truly make it happen.
Digital tools and digital organizing allow us to spread information and amplify our stories in ways that we haven't been able to do before, particularly with the saturation of corporate media.
Before like the big water hosing in Birmingham and all that, right? They were like there for 6 months and they were doing those actions, right? They're doing that and no one was paying attention, right? So, but in a day like today, if you kept on doing those actions, right, you'd have a whole apparatus and a whole social media platform in order to put your story out. It doesn't mean big media would have followed it, right? But folks who are within the movement would have known it at some level.
Anyone can have access to share their story with the rest of the world, and I think that's what makes this so important for communities that have been marginalized in the past.
I think for a lot of trans folks, we're so spread apart. Our community has been able to really connect online and find a sense of community on places like Facebook and Tumblr. And so social media has greatly improved, I think, the scope of where the movement could go.
I think it's given us new opportunities and platforms to raise money and share resources within the movement.
It's allowed me to get into contact with people that I never thought I would, and friends that I have that aren't, activists, so to speak. It allows me to express my opinions to them.
It provides folk who would not otherwise have access to critical conversations, to those conversations. Patrice Cullors and I organized under the banner of Black Lives Matter a freedom ride to Ferguson. 500 people showed up from across the country and Canada. All of that work happened virtually.
Sometimes when we get locked inside of the politics of struggle within the U.S., we tend to think that it's just us that's struggling. And sometimes when it's just us, then you have to say, then what are we doing wrong? But then when you see the rest of the world and you understand that, no, it's not just us. There's a whole bunch of other people, there's a whole bunch of other people that look like me, and that these dynamics, this structural racism plays out in very similar ways on a global scale, that we're then able to connect our struggles across globes, across countries, across neighborhoods.
You can watch in real time on Twitter the reaction to an injustice, the organizing around it, the petitions flowing.
We'll put one of these petitions together, we'll maybe get several thousand people to sign it, and then we use that as an organizing tool to reach back out to the folks who have signed those petitions, to then make calls into the bank to specifically target the CEO or the vice president or something along those lines. We don't necessarily have 1,000 people that we can bring to march on that person's house, but we can use the contacts that we have through those petitions to put pressure on some decision makers in a way that can be effective.
I know we've heard a lot from the disability community that social media is a place where folks are able to equally enter into a conversation and enter into actions. And so we try to figure out how to balance that, right? And how to create more opportunities and more entryways for participation. But we also really, really want to make sure that we're building power in the process. So it's not just about clicking like, it's not just about sharing an infographic, and it's certainly not just about the hashtag, right? The hashtag is a way for us to build consciousness. It's a way for us to have some sort of a shared identity, but it's just the starting point.
You can't be a Facebook revolutionary, that doesn't exist. And if we understand telecommunications and how they're in bed with the federal government, people have to understand that this tool is limited.
Obviously, one of the shortcomings is tracking and just the people watching. It's really, that's when being in person really comes in handy, and security culture is something that we're all struggling with. How do we hold it? How do we use the technology and also, bust it open from the inside?
There are spaces that need to be offline. There are confidential conversations that have to be had, and especially when you talk about surveillance with the community of people who are doing this work, and also with people who are infiltrating the movement and don't have the best intentions.
I was having a discussion recently when I was in New York, and someone who's a digital media expert, he said it very forthrightly. He said, surveillance is the business model of the internet. And he said it so forcefully and so simply, and I was like, whoa, that's the most succinct way I've ever heard it put.
There's a lot in the way of advertising revenue associated with being public with your opinion. There's a lot in the way of sharing tons of your information, not just with your friends, but with people who seek to monetize your voice, that we have to also consider when we're talking about sharing our messages and our values.
You really have to kind of know how to engage folks in a shorter span of time, get your point across. So it has made us maybe a little bit better at that, but I also think there's some loss there because it has also meant that if you can't capture someone's attention in 140 characters or less, you might lose them, and dialogues are much longer and much more, you need more investment for that.
It is the thing that we always fall back on. Like, just send a tweet out, just make a Facebook invite, and then people will come. And the reality situation is that doesn't always work. Like, it's a helpful tool, but it has to be a combination of, I think, digital media and social media with traditional media to be the most effective.
I think that the distinction between mobilizing and organizing is probably at the heart of any discussion about new social media.
Well, when we talk about mobilizing, which is social media is absolutely excellent for, we're talking about actions typically. We're talking about a rally, we're talking about a petition, and trust me, people who work in that space where petitions are important couldn't be happier for social media. I mean, what better way to get thousands of signatures for a particular issue or action than online? Whereas when we talk about organizing, we're talking about trying to transform a community, typically a nation, the world, So we are talking about being rooted in a particular place, and to people who may not even have access to online, there's still a digital divide.
So that often presents like a really critical challenge within the movement as things become more digitized. How do we reach folks who don't have access to those technologies consistently? What we talk about as organizers is building a team. A grouping of people that always should, get larger and larger, that move with you. It doesn't mean that we move in the same way. It doesn't mean that we all think the same, but it certainly means that we share goals and that we share vision. And, ideally, we also share strategy on how we're gonna get to where we wanna go. One thing I think is important for our cohort and our generation to really understand is that there is nothing at all that replaces community organizing.